economically, socially, and so on. And then I guess finally, linking this awareness of sustainability to formal and aesthetic research. And that part is important to me because often it's very easy to become so focused on sun studies and prevailing wind directions and those kinds of issues that you sometimes forget that there's a whole world of spatial formal investigation and, dare say, even composition that could become part of that. Now, before I focus, and what I'm showing you here, I should say, I'm not talking directly to these particular slides, but I'm showing you some of the student work from these 3 studios that I'm mentioning. And the reason I want to do that is because I'm trying to build an argument that's not based on just the learning barge, but on a series of projects which all share the same theoretical basis. Now, before I focus on the barge, though, I'd actually like to step back just for a minute and place that project within the larger theoretical context of my own recent work outside of the academic studio. And that work, for some time now, has been very interested in things like edges, intersections, hybrid conditions that work across a range of scales. One component of this research, rarely considered worthy of investigation, is the gap between one thing and another. Those kinds of places that we find in cities and even in buildings where scales and uses often collide, or where social and economic divisions are manifest. So for instance, spaces like under highway spaces, fissures through cities, areas where, for instance, an industrial zone is changing to a new use and there's a kind of often derelict or underutilized reality there. So the kinds of things, this is another image of the kinds of spaces that I've been interested in for a while, things like urban voids, railway lines, spaces that are often kind of ugly, ordinary, out of the way, places that prevent or present very difficult conditions and usually pretty unglamorous realities. Now, these kinds of spaces are certainly encountered on a daily basis, but at the same time, they're sites that are often unseen and uninhabited. And I've actually been working on a book project for too long now, focusing on an idea that I call sight out of mind. And the intention that I have for this term is that it have multiple readings. As a specific site in which things are explored, as for instance in a building site, and as a site or thing seen. Thus, a sight out of mind is a condition or a site that is visible but really not seen or minded, neither perceived visually or even cognitively. Now, these kinds of spaces have certainly proliferated in the contemporary landscape, and I would just want to mention maybe a few reasons why this is true. There's certainly been a tendency for us in this country to culturally and aesthetically undervalue land. There's this sort of dominance of this so-called efficiency-based planning mode, which is pretty accepted around most of the country. And then also just very minimal public investment in infrastructure, to name just a few. Now, an important part of thinking about these kinds of conditions is that human perception and methods of representation become particularly important considerations. Often because these kinds of places are not literally mapped. They're not understood in the way that you might understand Central Park or some very iconic space, for instance, within a city. And also that a kind of critical evaluation of these sites suggests a way of thinking, a way of seeing, and potentially a way of making within a city of both monuments and global flows that we find around us. Now, I guess ultimately, as a designer, from a very selfish point of view, I find these sites compelling because the typical rules don't apply. Because the normative language and methods of a single discipline are often inadequate. And sometimes we don't even know where to begin with that kind of condition. So I guess the argument that I'm ultimately making in terms of this sight out of mind idea and how it relates to the learning barge, which I'm going to spend most of the time talking about, is that it necessitates to the everyday, to seemingly mundane phenomena